Let us enter the world of The Boys, a dark and childish look at the realistic side of superhuman power. In the center of this world stands Homelander, the quote-unquote leader of the off-brand Justice League, and the epitome of what a superhero should not be. As we examine his character in detail, we're forced to face the question: is Homelander truly a good character, or merely a facade of one? Morrison has stated that Superman is a metaphor for America at its best. He is the embodiment of basic human goodness despite the fact that he isn't really human. It is quintessential for Superman that he was raised by good people. The entire reason he's a good person is because the Kents were good people. They taught him good values, morals, respect, etc. So, The Boys asks, what if Superman was a metaphor for America at its worst? And Homelander is the answer he gives to that question. But in reality, Homelander is more of an answer to, what if Superman was raised by the government? As he was raised in a lab by possibly the most idiotic and cruelest company ever established by mankind. And in their infinite idiocy, they have created an unstoppable, invincible man-child. In Season 1, Homelander exhibits great charm and confidence, bewitching us all into a sense of security with that horrible fake smile and superficial charisma of his. But beneath this front of paragon of altruism clearly lies something much more evil. He is the embodiment of the narcissism and materialism that define the competitive individualism of contemporary society. And he wears this prestigious persona of his, passionately embodying the ideas of truth, justice, and the American way, with such conviction that he himself often forgets the line that separates his genuine self from his performance. His public persona has been carefully manufactured, and this facade is crucial for both the character and the narrative of the show. Socially extroverted, he's always ready to step into the spotlight and give cheesy speeches about his unwavering commitment to justice. He is intoxicated by the status that his powers and the corporate banking of Vought provide him, to the point that he now views himself as a god amongst men. Seeing people idolize him clearly gives him immense satisfaction. This hero worship is more than just a source of pride for him. It is essential to his identity. His fragile sense of self is tethered to the belief that he is an object of awe. This was brought on first and foremost by his torturous childhood. Much like how Superman gains his powers from the sun, Homie has to bask in the people's worship of him to keep his fragile ego from collapsing. If he doesn't receive the attention he desperately craves, the macabre cold of emptiness overwhelms his senses, and whenever forced to confront the hollow shell of a man he truly is, he is whiplashed by intense feelings of incompetence and depression, which he copes with by lashing out at others. When he was a kid, Homie spent most of his time performing tasks, and constantly being pushed to his limits by a team of scientists. They were the only form of parental figures in his childhood, but attention was solely tied to his performance. He received affection only when he excelled at the tasks described to him, and his failure caused only torture and harsh criticisms. This experience is the root cause of the deeply transactional view of relationships he has as an adult. Success equals approval, and failure means suffering. As an adult, he admitted that this brought him nothing but misery as a child, describing it as drowning. As opposed to the cold, emotionless persona he projects behind the cameras, Homie is often overwhelmed by intense emotions like fear, anger, insecurity, and even sorrow. But since he was never taught how to manage his feelings by the scientists, he doesn't know how to regulate them on his own, resulting in his internal turmoil manifesting in the episodic trances he's shown to undergo, as well as in emotional outbursts, which only further alienates him from the Seven, the people he perceives as his family. This cycle of alienation adds to his feeling of isolation, forcing him to constantly struggle with the emotions he was made to suppress as a kid. Hence why I refer to him as a man-child. It's the most accurate description of his character. Problems arise, however, when you even just squint your critical eye at Vought's actions. Case in point, there's no immediate kill switch for any of the Seven. Answer me this: why would they ever make something that cannot be killed? The show claims they made Homelander out of sheer curiosity. Is it possible to make an unstoppable superhero? They asked themselves. But during their fuck it let's see experiment, they never stopped and thought about the potential negative ramifications of raising a child as a living weapon. Now that's autistic, if you ask me. They never thought that he could become a threat to not just to society, but to Vought itself. In a world where control and leverage are key, the absence of a kill switch seems, I don't know, imbecilic? And look at what happened in Season 3. It was only a matter of time before he took over the company. They made their bed, and you know the rest. Moreover, this is the season that attempts to retroactively fix this plot hole by establishing with the introduction of Soldier Boy that radiation fries the V out of a superhero system. But this directly contradicts what they've established in the first season of the show.
He doesn't have any weakness.
No.
There isn't a weapon on Earth that they haven't thrown at him. They've all failed.
Homelander survived the nuclear bomb, which I presume emits more radiation than Soldier Boy's explosion. This glaring oversight raises questions about Vought's competency as a company. In Season 1, Vought was presented as a tightly run machine which was a highly competent, hyper-capitalist power structure, but things have taken a turn for the worse after the Season 1 finale. The proper introduction of Stan Edgar marked the beginning of the sudden end of Vought's competency. Previously, Vought functioned as an active and influential character that affected the actions of the other characters and drove the main plot forward, like the hotel in The Shining, but now it has turned into one that barely has any presence at all anymore, with their actions bordering on implausible inaptitude. In Season 1, every member of the Seven were constantly depicted as always busy with numerous public relations events, personal appearances, and strategic crime events, which further served to reinforce Vought's omnipresent control and meticulous image management of its heroes. In Season 2, however, this is completely forgotten about. For example, Starlight is allowed to simply go on an unsupervised road trip, and Vought doesn't seem all that concerned about this either, despite Starlight having just been accused of being a traitor by Homelander himself. Similarly, the fact that the boys, who are wanted criminals by the way, are not subject to any considered effort by Vought to find them is fucking insane. Following the first season, instances of the heroes exhibiting any heroic behavior are also almost non-existent, with those few that do occur are largely characterized by Homelander acting like a damn fool and making mistakes. For instance, there is a scene in which he caves a person's skull in. Now, a question arose in my tiny little head when I considered what my eyes had just seen. How is Vought supposed to cover that shit show up? Please tell me. The notion that the criminal attacked Homelander first is interesting when you consider that he would literally not even feel anything. A similar justification was used in the first season as well, but this argument is simply stupid. Need I remind you that Homelander is bulletproof and survived a fucking nuke, and his victims are ordinary humans. They possess no real capability to harm him, therefore the notion that his life was in any amount of danger is moronic and fails to justify lethal force. It's the same shit as in Justice. The majority of the super evil people are portrayed as corrupt, self-serving, and immoral. While this fits with the way the show parodies the superhero genre, the overwhelming presence of corrupt superheroes comes across just as a vehicle for the creator to insert his own opinions into the show, thereby diminishing any semblance of his satirical merit. It creates an imbalance in the story. There are no truly good heroes, which harms the show's moral complexity and Butcher's ultimate dilemma. His goal is to take down the superheroes, which is driven by his belief that they are all inherently dangerous and corrupt. That and his personal vendetta against Homelander and what he represents. With no good superheroes existing, Butcher's moral choices are easy. If all the supers are evil, it is a lot easier for the audience to support his mission unconditionally. The story then becomes a simple, morally unambiguous fight between the superheroes and the boys. However, if some of them were genuinely good, the narrative will gain some more complexity, which is good because it makes the story more engaging to watch. Butcher's simple black and white worldview will be challenged by other characters, forcing not just him but also the audience to think about the ethical implications of his actions, and whether his childish approach to dealing with soups is justifiable. The way it stands as of now is, it seems like 99% of soups deserve to be killed by the boys, so why shouldn't we support Butcher's plan? You need good heroes to make Butcher's ultimate dilemma have any weight at all. In Season 4 they attempt to introduce this with the Kessler character, but it all falls flat because, of course, without a balanced depiction of good and bad superheroes, the audience will obviously support Butcher's insane methods without question. And that is bad because we are rooting for a man that had no issue with using a newborn as a weapon and blowing up an infant in Season 1. He tried to blow up a baby. Let that sink in. Good heroes would introduce some much needed emotional stakes into the show. When the audience knows there are some superheroes that are worth saving, the conflict is more engaging and memorable. Look at the current discussion around the show. Nobody's talking about the girls get it done fight at the end of Season 2 anymore, because there was no emotional weight behind it at all. That's indicative of the simple fact that all the fight scenes in the show are just set pieces that were meant to watch mindlessly, like in Justice. Having genuinely good heroes be active in the story means the viewers will be torn between Butcher's justified anger and the need to protect the innocent superheroes. In the beginning, and only in the beginning, the character of Starlight and A-Train in Season 4 provided a counterbalance to Butcher. Annie struggled to keep her integrity in a corrupt system at a depth, making her character sympathetic and likable. This resulted in an engaging conflict between her and Butcher. But 3 characters is not enough when every other character introduced is cartoonishly evil. More good heroes will let the show explore grey areas in morality, power and justice. It will challenge the notion, which is simply glossed over in Season 4, that grey power corrupts absolutely. The main issue above all else is that the US government allowed a public company to reach the level of power they have risen to in the show. In real life, many regulations, antitrust laws, and checks and balances stop any single company from rising above the actual US government. Vought's rise, having its own superhero army on speed dial and power to control national events, damages the suspension of disbelief too much to be ignored. Then there's the way the legal system is portrayed in the show. Vought being able to escape legal punishment for its actions is simply baffling. The evidence against Vought should have resulted in dozens of lawsuits and criminal charges. And the way the show presented that Season 2 subplot and then swept it under the rug in the next episode communicates that this is a world where one corporation has more power than the fucking justice system. This not only breaks our suspension of disbelief, but also forbids the show from having any future tension regarding anything with the state of the company. Because no matter what happens, Vought will always get away without any trouble. Just look at Season 4, now they rule the entire country because of its comatose governmental body. This is something the show could have improved on over the comics. They could have provided some needed substantial justification for how Vought got over the US government's robust regulatory mechanisms, making their monopoly on superheroes more believable, and avoided the show undermining its own social commentary on US politics. The notion that, in a world of corruption, Vought, a company corrupt to its very foundation, could operate unchecked and hide the fact that superheroes are created in a lab, is cute. Which leads into the problem with Edgar claiming that Vought is, and always has been, a pharmaceutical company. The Compound V leak doesn't destroy them, somehow. They say it gives superpowers so it actually benefits them, somehow. Vought deliberately incites chaos with the aim of prompting government demand for Compound V, thereby facilitating its distribution to law enforcement. This strategy prioritizes immediate profit maximization with little to no concern for the long-term consequences to either the company itself or to the entire planet. Genius. They want to potentially destroy the world for some dollar bills, y'all. I wouldn't even consider this a parody of the machinations of corporations, it's so bad. The way they advance their agenda is by creating fear of the super terrorists while simultaneously manufacturing them. They play both sides to hide their role in all of it. But if their primary objective is the commercialization of Compound V for maximum profit, why the need for terrorists to sell V in the first place? For such a successful company, it's odd that they would give away the one thing making them billions through marketing, ads and merchandise. Once it's widespread, they will no longer have a monopoly on it. Once the drug is publicly distributed, other companies could easily reverse engineer it, thereby eliminating Vought's monopoly on it. Nevertheless, Edgar appears convinced that their current course of action would, in fact, ensure the company's survival. If they truly believe that the leak of Compound V will not harm their interests, why not leak it themselves in a controlled and strategically advantageous manner? Also, why has, prior to Season 1, no one realized and questioned why all the superheroes were exclusively US citizens? Isn't that kind of suspicious to you? International communities and even people in the United States should have identified this anomaly as indicative of some sort of hidden agenda. I know it's a meme that Americans don't know anything about other countries or where they even are on the map, but they are not this oblivious to what is happening in their own country. Take the Chernobyl incident for example. Within a matter of days following the explosion, the entire globe became aware of what had happened in Russia. Every country with nuclear power plants began asking themselves the same question: can this happen to us as well? And will this affect our citizens too? Moreover, what if Vought chooses an infant as another superhero? They inject them, they grow up to be incredibly stubborn, and then they decide they don't want to be a superhero, but want to live a normal, mundane life instead. That's billions of dollars wasted, simply because their selection method is unreliable. Parents cannot force their children to be what they want them to be. Just consider all the people that were raised by religious parents. A lot of them stopped being religious after they became adults, or they just outright refused to follow in their parents' footsteps, even as children. There's a lot of evidence that shows people eventually escape their nurture, even within the show's narrative, Homelander, by the end of Season 1, escapes the papa role Vought had nurtured him into. So, Vought relying on the parents raising them to be heroes is, to say the least, not very smart. But back to our homie. Vought should have known that lack of physical contact, severe isolation, and no contact with the outside world would result in a homicidal maniac with godlike powers and a stunted brain development. Scientific studies have shown that if infants don't receive the necessary attention, social interaction, and most importantly, love, it will lead to long-term, perhaps even permanent psychological damage. Depression and isolation are two of the worst conditions a social creature, such as a human, can ever endure. Most parents inadvertently cause some sort of profound mental illness in their children. There are child-rearing books that literally instruct them to let their babies cry in their cribs all night and day long. The reasoning they use is that of delusion. Eventually, the baby will get bored or too tired from crying to continue. Research shows that children who are victims of their parents' ignorance display anxiety, lack of curiosity, and little to no interest in playing, all of which hinder their development. The surrogate mother experiment also found that the monkeys would experience significant stress and anxiety when their cloth, which was their only source of comfort, was removed from their cages. Attachment is crucial. Beyond sensory and intellectual stimulation, we just need social bonds. But the scientists raising Homelander were obsessed with his powers development, and there was no room for empathy. Besides a small blue blanket, there was no other way to relieve his suffering for him. They never took the time to comfort, heal, or even lovingly embrace him. He was deprived of the most important aspects of childhood, nurture and security. Kids usually inherit their moral compass, worldview, and set of beliefs from mainly their parents, with their environment or culture serving as a secondary influence that shapes and reinforces these core values over time. John, being forced to learn through the small personal experiences he did have, essentially had to raise himself. When he was around 6, he attempted to make a connection with Vogelbaum. He tried cuddling with him, but he was not meant for love or companionship. He was supposed to be a weapon, so Vogelbaum rejected all his requests for affection, and this abuse and exploitation by an adult led him to develop his current twisted image of love. After learning about Thanksgiving and seeing imagery of happy families, he wondered to his teacher about his own mother. Hesitant at first, the teacher says that she can be his mother. Like any child yearning for affection, John hugged her, but accidentally crushed her to death. Horrified by what he did, he runs to the corner of the lab and hugs his blue blanket, it being his only source of comfort yet again. The scientists come in and, in an attempt to calm him down, they promise that everything will be fixed by them. Another teacher will take her place soon. This experience teaches him that people are expendable, and murder is nothing to be ashamed of. During his childhood and early adulthood, his emotional needs were not met. He didn't receive any of the unconditional love provided by a family, probably what any child needs the most. Not love for what he could do, but for who he was. Therefore, it makes perfect sense that he would not understand and know how to teach Ryan to handle his emotions, and would view them as weakness, a sort of cancer that needs to be cut out of his son, which leads to their relationship eventually crumbling. Homelander's inflated sense of superiority stems from his belief that he is the Homelander, Earth's mightiest hero. He views himself as far more intelligent, talented, and charismatic than anyone else, which in his mind means he is inherently more deserving of admiration and respect. His mission to protect the innocent, appointed by Vought when he was let out of his cage as an adult, only fuels this delusion of grandeur of his. He recognizes the emotional distress he causes, but being simply indifferent to the feelings of others, he doesn't see the point in amending them unless it serves his interest in some type of way. Despite his facade of a perfect being, not everything he touches turns to gold. In fact, most of it turns to shit. He's working around the clock to mentally cover up any flaws, mistakes, or setbacks that could damage his perfect image. He constantly inflates his own accomplishments, setting an unrealistic expectation for himself which he believes he must live up to. Yet underneath his impenetrable skin, he feels quite vulnerable. He is, just like a child, extremely sensitive to the scrutiny of others, constantly haunted by the fear that minor flaws will break his meticulously created public image. The mind's greatest critic is itself. Due to his upbringing, he developed an acute sense of self-awareness, always attuned to even his most minute faults and mistakes, such as noticing a single strand of gray hair. In an attempt to hide these fractures, he adopted a range of defensive behaviors, such as hiding his true self, lashing out in anger, and basing his self-worth on the validation of others, all of which were engraved in him by the scientists that raised him. When he feels attacked, he begins daydreaming about grandiose fantasies, where he is victorious. For example, he confronts a large group of protesters speaking out against him. When things don't go as he had hoped, he imagines himself annihilating the entire crowd with his heat vision. This fantasy gives him a huge hit of dopamine his underdeveloped brain desperately hungers for, and makes him feel satisfied. Or when he's forced to talk about a family he has never met, and recounts intimate memories he has been taught to tell for a documentary. In this instance, he is able to create details of his own fantasy, momentarily being lost in the false memories of a safe, joyful, and loving childhood which he never had. Homelander's deepest desire is to be loved and accepted, but the way he goes about gaining them results in the abuse of the very people he is trying to get close to. He is also aware of how he makes the people who really know him feel, how Maeve is completely repulsed by him, and how Madeline and Starlight are terrified of him. When he is by himself, he laments and shows genuine regret over the man he has turned into. He visits Vogelbaum in private, and though he remains as cold and distant as he was during his youth, he provides Homie with a sort of apology. This encounter with his father figure was yet another episode of rejection and dismissal, further adding to the damage of his fractured psyche. And this interaction will also have a lasting impact on him for the rest of the show. Or would have had. More on that later. In Season 2, it's revealed that he didn't kill Vogelbaum. Instead, he left him paralyzed from the waist down. Despite his hatred, he could not bring himself to kill his creator because, deep down, he still seeks his approval. He tries to push aside these unwanted feelings of rejection and unworthiness, but this bottling up technique of coping is only effective temporarily. After the confirming and biting words of Vogelbaum, he cannot deny his shame and sadness any longer. He is a mistake. Masterfully setting up the end of his arc for the final episode of the first season. But Vogelbaum is not fully responsible for the way Homelander is. When they elected him as the leader of the Seven, Vought continuously rewarded his narcissism and ruthlessness. They groomed him into the perfect creation for their use, invincible and charming on the outside, and cold and heartless on the inside. His narcissistic tendencies were stroked by Vought's conditioning and objectification. And at the center of it all was Madeline Stillwell, who managed to abuse his greatest weakness, his deep-seated desire for intimacy and affection. She weaponized her touch in order to keep him in check by way of flirtation. This invoked a sense of belonging, which satisfied him very much so, even if it was confusing for his underdeveloped brain at first. Her words played directly into his childlike moral framework where obedience means reward. Due to her manipulations, Homie quickly developed sexual feelings for her. Not surprising though, as his sexual desires were suppressed for all of his puberty, so he often confuses his familial love with romantic love. Consequently, having no regard for hers or anyone's boundaries, he began spying on her with his X-ray vision. This led to him catching tender moments between Madeline and her baby, watching the bond that he was stolen from and still longs for dangled in front of him, being constantly reminded of the one thing he'll never ever have. Something started to grow inside of him. He thought he escaped the daily tortures he underwent as a child when he became the Homelander. He believed he had moved past the pure, unfiltered connection that only exists between parent and child. But he thought wrong. He is the embodiment of insecurity, after all. Any ethical scientific study requires the consent of all parties, but John's experiments and treatments were imposed on him without his approval. He was only a baby. How could he have signed off on being the victim of both physical and mental torture? This is exactly the reason why we don't experiment on infants. Well, human infants. Any experiment on any living being that is unable to consent is monstrous, yet some of them must be done. They are necessary evils for the improvement and understanding of life. But what the Vought scientists did to John was not necessary. It was unethical, inhumane, unforgivable, and they have reaped what they have sowed. With the exception of Vogelbaum, who got off relatively easy. It almost seems out of character for Homelander to not kill him. I guess they needed him for shock value in Season 2. These tortures he was forced to endure ingrained in him a sense of ownership by Vought, that, despite his godlike powers, he does not belong to himself, but to a company. He is Vought. He lived and continues to live, hint hint, in a nightmare most people will never be able to relate to, constantly reliving the isolation and emptiness of his childhood. The reveal that Becca and his child are alive, and the role Madeline played in hiding them from him, finally breaks him. He reacts to this emotional overload the only way he learned how, by externalizing it through blame and violence. When Butcher captures Madeline, Homie's arc culminates in a brutal display of his power, using his heat vision to burn her to death. Then, after witnessing this grim spectacle, Butcher decides to blow up the bomb that was strapped onto her, taking her child with him in the process. But in a surprising turn of events, Homelander saves them before the explosion could harm them. I cannot express how big of a deal this is. Homelander saved the baby from Butcher. This act seems completely out of character for him, right? He despised the baby, seeing him as competition for Madeline's affection. Considering who he is, it would make perfect sense if he let him die instead of saving him. Nevertheless, the C4 was never intended to physically hurt Homelander. It was meant to kill Madeline in hopes that her death would hurt him emotionally, just like how he hurt Butcher. Butcher kills the baby in an act of petulant defiance, and Homelander saves both of them. He is more human than Butcher. Now, in a normal, well-written TV show, this would signal Homelander's realization that he has truly no need for anyone and completely adopting his ruthless persona. But alas, no. In fact, this only signals the character's deteriorating writing quality. Over the past century, interest in changing identity has greatly increased, especially in fiction and psychology, two of my favorite subjects. This curiosity led to the current oversimplified but useful distinction between two types of characters: static and dynamic. A static character remains the same person over the course of the story, having undergone no meaningful evolution in their nature. In contrast, a dynamic character undergoes a rather significant change by the end of their journey. When I say change, I don't mean changes in quality of life, but changes within the character. Changes like insight, understanding, such as understanding of their situation, allegiances, or core values. The change, or lack thereof, at stake in this distinction is a change in the character's nature, i.e., who they are as a person. For an unrelated example, if a character discovers he has a son, and realizes that the person closest to him had kept this information from him throughout the story, this may or may not result in a sort of change in his personality, values, or general outlook on life that will count him as an instance of a dynamic character. He might remain the same attention-seeking man-child he was before this shocking revelation, or such a heartbreaking event might motivate a change in his outlook on life. Only in the latter case are we dealing with a dynamic character. This means that, while it certainly is important to take account of what the story implies as the motivation of this changing character, these causal and conditional factors should not be included as part of the description of what the changing character consists in. A factor is not an element. You want to avoid the temptation to substitute externals for internals. Externals are often explicit and obvious, while internals are more implicit and take some work to get a clear grasp of. If we look back at the difference between static and dynamic characters, it quickly becomes obvious that we are dealing with two different types of plot. The first type is one in which the way the character views themselves changes drastically at some point in the narrative. In media analysis, this is called dynamic characterization. The significance of this change depends on how we judge it. We can interpret it as a fall, as in it represents a negative transformation or decline, or it could be considered as an achievement, meaning growth, progress, or success. Whether the change causes the character to be diminished or enhanced depends on the context provided by the story. The other type of plot entices the audience to believe that the character will change, but by the end it turns out they stay the same person throughout the story. This is called static characterization. In the same situation where a dynamic character will change can either be viewed as the static character retaining their integrity, in other words, corresponding to the dynamic character's fall, they would hold firm to their principles or values. The achievement is akin to a static character's disappointment, suggesting a lack of growth or missed opportunity for change. It's safe to say that Homelander was greatly changed over the course of the first season. Spiritually, he was suffering, burning the midnight oil day in and day out, and while he faced his childhood trauma and newly emerging concerns, he achieved a depth of spiritual understanding more profound than that which he left behind in his childhood. Him murdering Madeline represents an achievement for his character. He was finally able to move past his need for approval, attention, and love, leading to a full, complete adoption of the heartless person he has been masquerading as. He changes as a person, meaning he received dynamic characterization, meaning he's a dynamic character. However, his sudden regression and circular characterization in the subsequent seasons lacks the necessary build-up. The transition is abrupt and unsubstantiated, There's neither external nor internal elements provided to justify such a drastic change. This only serves to undermine his great character writing in Season 1. When you're dealing with a dynamic character, you have an obligation to the audience to provide them with all the major elements that facilitate said character's change in the story. Failing to do so results in a subpar story, where the character's evolution will seem inconsistent, leading to a less immersive story. But it's also important to balance this with subtlety and nuance. You gotta leave some for us media analysts, I mean. Not every single detail has to be laid out in a text. It can be implied through character actions, dialogue and/or interactions, or even their tone of voice alone. Basically, while the first season carefully constructed Homelander's arc, the following seasons puts him on ice by not explaining his whiplash-inducing character regression that only serves to disrupt the narrative flow between seasons, which is especially problematic in Season 2 as it's supposed to take place directly after the first. Each season he goes through the same identical arc. In the Season 1 finale, he kills Madeline, signaling his severance of the little part of humanity he had left. This sets the perfect stage for Psycho Homelander in the next season. But then Season 2 kicks off, and in the very first episode we find that he had regressed back to where his character started in the first season. Someone riddled with mommy issues. The only difference being that, instead of being in love with Madeline, he's in love with Stormfront. Then, by the end of Season 2, once again, he realizes he doesn't need anyone and he can do anything, setting him up to go rogue in the next season. But Season 3 comes around and the character is yet again back at the starting line, obsessed with fame, ratings and public perception. By the season's notorious end, he yet again decides he does not care about anything, setting up that in the next season he will go absolutely Kanye, go batshit Kanye crazy. And it's not just the homie that suffers from this. Eric Kripke is so obviously obsessed with holding back the entire cast of characters from growing at all that if you hadn't noticed it yet, then as a writer, this is what you should avoid at all costs. Learn from other people's mistakes. Kripke loves teasing the fuck out of the audience, drawing them in with the promise of character progression, only to reset them back to their original state simply because he wants to elongate the show for more seasons. At some point you must realize what is happening. At some point you must notice the gigantic fucking swollen black balls that is giving you. Especially if you're a woman. Then in Season 4, there's finally a significant development. While he still returns to the status quo of his character, there's a new twist to it. Homie is dying of old age. This is something genuinely interesting. It adds a whole new layer of intrigue to the character. He has been groomed into a perfect persona, but at the end of the day, he is still human, meaning he is not eternal, he is not a god. It is unfortunate that it doesn't entirely make sense given that he's Soulja Boy's son, who doesn't age, and is hailed as the greatest superhero in the world, the absolute best of the best. It's odd they didn't make him immortal too, especially since it has been established that they did not plan for any contingency plan against him. But regardless, it's still an interesting dilemma to have him face in a season that did not amount to anything substantial. In closing, I'll say this. The Boys isn't particularly well written, and at some point the discussion about it has shifted from revolving around the actual story and character developments to being about its cheap shock value and political quote-unquote commentary. You see, there's a difference between political commentary and messaging. Andor is a show that includes political commentary. The Boys is a show that includes political messaging. Alas, criticizing The Boys in any negative manner often leads to reflexive defenses from the fans that suggest your dislike of the show is merely a symptom of being the very target of its satire, a cope that diverts attention from any substantive critique of its artistic merit. If there's a singular point you should take away from this video, it should be that you are not watching a well-written show that is interested in its characters. You are watching the showrunner indulging in his own political beliefs, fetishes, and opinions. From his obsession with ham-fisting his views on a certain group of people, all the way to his warped view on the no-no R-word that everyone is afraid to say nowadays because we live in an age of unprecedented privilege, so even the slightest hint of something negative will send us into shock. This indulgence is not necessarily an issue. A vast number of other writers do exactly the same thing. George R.R. Martin with his A Song of Ice and Fire novels, J.R.R. Tolkien with his Lord of the Rings novels, and Joe Kelly with his What's So Funny About Truth, Justice and the American Way comic book. Simply put, authors make their best work when they write about something they're passionate about. Eric Kripke is obviously very passionate about making fun of right-wingers and modern Hollywood, while still being part of Hollywood. I never understood that. I hear a lot of people talk about how much they hate Twitter or TikTok, and how bad social media is for your brain. Yet they still use them. They still have active accounts on the very same websites they claim to despise. If you hate social media, why are you using it? If you hate modern Hollywood, why are you in it? Tangent aside, what separates George, Token, and Joe from Eric is that they are all good writers. Make whatever you want to make, say whatever you want to say with it, just make it good. That's the only unbreakable rule of storytelling. And The Boys, if judged in its entirety, is not good, simply because Kripke is not a good showrunner. He is a Hollywood celebrity determined to get away from Hollywood, that is ironic, over-determined, and brassy with self-importance. Good day, sir.